Hello, hello. This episode is all about what is somatics. I am a somatic coach, and most of the time, people have zero idea of what I'm talking about. They're like, what? Even if I say I'm an embodiment coach, they're like, okay, like I get that a little bit more, but what? And while it's becoming more mainstream, it's nowhere near actually being fully mainstream. And while I was prepping for this, I was deep diving into the history, into the definitions, and I found myself getting really stuck because the field is so vast and so varied. So, what I'm going to do is give you my definition of somatics, what somatics has done for me, how I orient to it. Maybe at the end, I'll give you some examples of some modalities, maybe not, can't commit. And what I hope you walk away with is a better understanding of the work that I do, why I do it, the types of transformation that it can facilitate. Even if you don't 100% know what a session with me is like, you'll at least know the juiciness, the rich, like felt sense of what is somatics. So, ultimately, somatics is the process of coming in tune with the living body. Somatics is interested in and prioritizes the body, not just the mind, not just the mind body connection, not just how we can biohack our way to be more productive and get more dopamine so we can be a better worker in capitalism, but how the body is our human experience. Ultimately, through somatics, I've learned that the body is our guide. It is our internal compass. I believe that we have a soul and it existed before this body and it'll exist after. But for right now, for however many years we have on this planet, we are our body. From the moment we're born, we're literally shaped by our bodily experiences, how our parents hold us and talk to us. Until our brains are fully developed, our brains are directly being shaped by our somatic, our bodily experiences. The norms in our community, what we see on TV, all the things we feel, this shapes our nervous system, this shapes how we view the world, this shapes how we act. And yet our society really prioritizes thinking, rationality, logic, which certainly has their time and place. But we're actually not that logical of beings. Thank you, behavioral economics, for telling us that. And ultimately, when we prioritize logic and what's strategic or smart, we're often disconnected from ourselves. So Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And the thing is, we just didn't know what we know now about the nervous system and the brain. So yes, he's true, but maybe the ad hoc would be, I experience the world and it shapes how I think, and thus it shapes who I am. If I had to, make up a little variation on the spot, that's what I would say. So our cognitive experiences, our emotional experiences are somatic experiences. Our emotions don't just happen in our brain. Even though we might call certain things mental health, it doesn't end at the neck down. What we feel, what we think is somatic experiences. We are constantly having sensations and feelings in our body, and it's not limited to what is happening in our brain. So things like love, anger, sadness, grief, delight, awe, those are happening in our body. We actually know that we're experiencing those through our body primarily. I just saw a really funny study. I won't go into it, but these poor rats, they basically found by manipulating a few things that rats actually experience increased heart rate that causes anxiety. So many of what we call mental health is actually originally a somatic experience that our brain then labels as anxiety, anger, etc. So ultimately, a core argument of my work is that the body and somatics is really our primal language. I would call body language our earliest and most foundational language. It's the language of sensation, of all the things that are stirring within us, of emotions, of energy within the body. And my work is primarily to help people relearn this language. It's why my group program is called Body Language Lab, because I want people to re-embody this language that as babies we have. We know it, we're fluent in it. We know how to speak this before we ever learn English or whatever our native tongue is. And so I help people reconnect with this language, learn the alphabet, learn how to speak it, learn when to use which words, which sentences. As babies, we're really deeply attuned to the felt sense within us, the sensations, the emotions, the energies within us, and within the spaces that we're in. So, babies cry when there's a loud noise, when there's an argument with parents. They're sensing all of that. And what do babies do when they feel things internally? They coo, they laugh, they cry, they wiggle. They react to the inner stirrings within them. So we're born being able to feel deeply and respond in a way that is seemingly most appropriate. It's just that we're socialized to then ignore these things and to be good students, good employees, good partners, and ignore what's happening within us and ignore the subtle signs and signals that our body is always sending us. Also, somatics is the best way to work through and heal trauma and to support yourself if you're dealing with chronic stress, burnout, or any type of chronic health issue, autoimmune disease that's really severely impacting your body and your quality of life. I'll specifically talk about trauma though, because trauma is an embodied experience. It fundamentally changes how we view the world, how we view others. It puts us on high alert and protective mode, and it creates default ways of being and responding that are just so painful. And there's just these established paths that are really hard for us to get out of. Most of my clients, I'm pretty sure every single one, has been in therapy. They know their shit. They know what's going on, and yet it keeps happening. I joke that my clients are people whose body's keeping the score. Not all of them. It's a spectrum. But it was only through somatic coaching that they were really able to change how they relate to their triggers, how they relate to their stress, how their body goes through getting activated, getting shut down, anger, whatever it is. It's through somatic coaching that people stopped people pleasing. They were able to be like, oh, I see where I do that. I see where I abandon myself. It's how people are sleeping better, how they're able to quickly shift their state. There's so much juiciness that happens that wasn't happening in therapy for them. And that's because they're actually working through their body and not just processing the thoughts, not just trying to change how they're going to respond from a cognitive way. And for me, I came to somatics because I struggled with anxiety, depression, and pain for many, many years. It kept getting worse. I wasn't so sure about this living thing. So I was like, this seems like a shit deal that I have. And if it's going to keep being like this, I don't really want to do it. And somatics was what helped me actually be with intense sensations and emotions, and helped me not be totally consumed by them, helped me give myself self-compassion, and helped me shift out of those states instead of just getting stuck there. And over time, my pain went away. I now no longer meet the clinical criteria for anxiety and depression, and my life is just fundamentally different. And really the research and evidence behind this is what convinced me, because it's not just this woo-woo shit of like, feel your body and everything gets better. That's not at all what I'm saying, although if you think it is, all good. The other thing that I want to share personally is how much somatics helped me with sexual trauma and with challenges dating. So unfortunately, I've experienced multiple forms of sexual trauma, which really impacted how I date. I would just very easily go into a freeze and a fawn response. Freeze being when you feel like you can't actually respond, you can't actually move, especially if I, for example, communicated my boundaries and someone didn't honor them. It makes so much sense that I would go into a freeze response. And I would get triggered really, really fucking easily. Like someone would kiss me without consent and I would just go into a freeze response and then totally lose my shit afterwards. And dating was really hard. Ooh, it took a long time, but through somatics, I was able to really understand these patterns, understand how do I intervene? How do I change this? What are the things that I can change early on? How do I communicate my boundaries? What are my boundaries? What is the pace that I need? And get to a point where now I'm just like, here's how I date. And now where I'm like, I'm not even gonna freaking bother. If I'm not excited about you, if I'm not curious, we're not going on a date. And all these small and big shifts that took me from having dating be so deeply triggering that I would barely do it to now feeling so seen, so supported, loving how I'm dating, having the types of connections that are so nourishing, and just feeling, frankly, in awe of how my life is different. And so, what I'm getting at is that somatics really helps us become more aware of our body, of what's happening, become more aware of our patterns. What are our emotions? What are our reactions? What are the habits that just happen? Why am I doing this? Where does this stem from? Is it the past? Is it the present? What's the underlying need or hurt? Yes, you could totally think about these cognitively, but it doesn't actually mean that your body registers that you feel seen and heard. And there's so much wisdom when we tune into our bodies, when we tune into the emotional landscape, the physical and sensation level landscape of what's happening, and understand our needs from there, and understand how do I make a change slow and steadily from there. Sensation tells us so much, y'all. It tells us what is for us. It tells us, what job do we want? What excites us? What enlivens us? What inspires us? It tells us the shit that is not for us, that gut instinct. Just tells us like, oh, I don't feel good about that. I don't know. I'm feeling resentful. Like, the language of sensation gives us so much richness to work with, to understand ourselves and our needs, that if we just do things from how society tells us of what's smart, of what's strategic, of what's socially accepted, what's normal, we're going to bypass ourselves, and we're going to put ourselves in situations that don't feel good, that result in harm. And there's a beautiful quote by Viktor Frankl, and it is, "Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." So somatics gives us the ability to notice, how does stimuli affect us? How does our workplace, how does our partner, how does just everything in our life, how does it impact us? What's happening in our body? What's our default way of reacting? What are our needs? And then grow that space. So instead of quickly responding, instead of quickly sending that text, instead of saying that thing, pausing, being with the sensation, even if they're difficult, supporting ourselves through those difficult sensations, and then building out our options of responses, building out the menu, the buffet, the toolkit that we support ourselves and how we show up in relationship to others. Somatics gives us all of that. My somatic work brings together two lineages, and it's really important for me to name these two lineages because they're different. I weave them together in a pretty seamless way, but I really want you to understand. And there's not just two, but I do consider these the two broad buckets of somatics that I'm seeing. So the first is this Western neurobiological, neurophysiological perspective, all about understanding how do our brains and bodies work, how does our nervous system work, how does trauma impact us, and like, what does the research say works in terms of healing and changing. Amazing, super helpful. The second is politicized somatics that is oriented towards the future that we want, both personally and collectively. So I was first introduced to this via the neurobiological lens, particularly the research by Dr. Stephen Porges on the vagus nerve, and also the work of Peter Levine around trauma and somatic experiencing. And this work saved my life. I had the polyvagal map, which I'll do an episode on, where I could see, I'm getting stuck in sympathetic and dorsal shutdown. That's why life is so hard. That's why I'm struggling to function. That's why manifesting feels gaslighting. I had a map to understand myself in a way that I didn't. And I went from feeling broken and helpless to being like, oh, well, I just need to do these things. Doesn't mean they're easy per se, but I had a map for where I was at and where I could go for a journey of healing. So some key leaders in this, like I mentioned, Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Stephen Porges, Deb Dana, who really translated Stephen Porges' work, Dr. Lyons, who I trained under, who's the founder of the Embody Lab, and so many more. So these are all people who are really translating the science of our brains and our bodies and our nervous systems into language and terms and practices that can help us deeply connect with ourselves, that can help us move through emotions and stress and resource and increase resilience. And this work is so varied. There's so many practitioners I've learned from. There's so many different perspectives and practices. And I won't mention them all, but ultimately, these all have the lens of being more based in science and based on the individual and what the individual can do to heal and change. So it really prioritizes healing and nervous system regulation. And often it's taking out of context practices that have maybe come from indigenous cultures, have maybe come from Eastern cultures and been part of a richer philosophy or religious tradition. And turning it into simply a self-care practice. And often, these leaders are lacking a social analysis of here's how systems of power contribute to trauma. Like they're just like, okay, an individual's traumatized, here's what you need to do. And, their work is incredible and I use what I've learned and I teach a lot of these things and these practices. But it's not enough for me. And that's why I bring in politicized somatics, which I'm so grateful. My first somatic therapist, Danny Leah Strauss, who's based in Durham, North Carolina, and sees clients virtually. You should check her out. She introduced me to Stacey Haynes and generative somatics. So Stacey Haynes, amazing human, so influenced by her work. She learned through Richard Strozzi Heckler, who founded Strozzi Somatics, and he really weaved together Aikido, the martial arts, and psychology. And this body of work is really, this lineage is really focused on what matters to you. What's important to you? What do you long for? What's the future that you want? In this work, we create commitment statements. So, for example, my first commitment statement with my declaration with my current coach, Nick Zaleski, was, I'm a commitment to letting my body be my guide. And when you orient around that, you're going to live your life in a different way than if you didn't have that commitment or if you were committed to productivity or whatever, making money. So this work is really helping us understand what's important to us. And how do our habitual responses get in the way of that? It includes this analysis of how are we shaped by both individual things, by interpersonal relationships, by our community, by our landscape, by laws, many of which they draw from a public health framework, which I was trained on during my master's. And what I love about Stacey Haynes' work that she's, to me, been a leader in, but so many other people are doing this work, is politicizing somatics and saying it's not enough to do this on an individual level. We need to analyze, why are people experiencing trauma? How is this happening? And we need to use somatics as a way to contribute to social change. So generative somatics has worked a lot with organizations primarily run by people of color, serving people of color, queer communities, like really amazing nonprofits or just community level work, training them of like, how do y'all orient to your longings? How do you weave somatics and how you do the thing so that our attempts at social change aren't perpetuating some of the fucked up dynamics that often nonprofits do? Shout out to anyone who's worked at a nonprofit who's been traumatized by it. And ultimately, our collective why is really powerful. We can't get there unless we're embodied. And many of the teachers that I've been influenced by are women, queer folks, people of color, and differently abled folks. And that's what I love. I don't notice as much in the more Western medical side of somatics. So two of those being Adrienne Marie Brown, who really weaves in pleasure, and Prentice Hemphill, who I forget their exact title, but they were like the embodiment VP for the Black Lives Matter movement. And they have an organization called the Embodiment Institute, which I highly recommend you checking out, especially if you're a person of color. So for me, I really care about helping individuals, and I view somatics as an essential ingredient in social change. We can't change the world if we don't have a vision based on a future that we want. If we're only oriented to what we don't want, it's just not enough fuel to get us there. And we can't change the world if we're in survival mode, if we're disembodied. So for me, somatics and social change just go together, and you can't have them without one or the other. So those are the two lineages that I bring together and the perspectives that I weave together. And there's so many teachers I left out, and there's so much nuance, but that's the sort of broad strokes. I do want to talk about kind of 3 different buckets of somatic practices that you might experience working with me or working with a different somatic coach. Of course, it's going to vary based on how they were trained, and there's so many. So first is connecting with the felt sense, with sensation, learning to expand your capacity to sense it, to describe it, to be with difficult sensations, and really getting curious about what these sensations might be telling you. So this is all about increasing somatic awareness. The second is practices that might help you calm, might help you go from maybe a little bit of dysregulated, a little bit activated, irritated, to calming your body and bringing you more into the present moment. We really can't think our way to calm. That's not how our nervous system works. Our parasympathetic nervous system sends data from our brain to our body, and that's how we calm. So things like breath, movement, touch, and sound are really amazing ways to help calm your body and bring you into the now. And some modalities, but not all, actually involve movement with the purpose of moving energy that could be stuck in their body or energies that's present. And what these modalities recognize, including the work I do, is that we can't just calm our way down all the time. In fact, anger, rage, these have rightful places. And if we only calm them down, we're bypassing ourselves. So how do we let this energy move through us, complete it, so we can get on the other side and be with and process the emotions that are underneath? A few somatic modalities that I want to touch upon. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Maybe I'll do that someday. But frankly, that would require a lot of research, and I didn't feel like doing that. So somatic stress release is what I was trained in, and it's really a bottom-up approach, helping people connect to their body and sensations and emotions instead of changing thoughts, increasing that somatic awareness, increasing the capacity and the toolkit of being able to move through activated energy. Sometimes it's screaming, sometimes it's punching a pillow, sometimes it's shaking, sometimes it's the tiniest little arm movement. And then helping people process the emotions underneath. What is the unmet need? What boundaries do you need? How do we create that? And helping people experience deep restoration and nourishment. I lead practices that leave people feeling like they're floating away to a cloud. And all of these bits are really essential. It's not just one. I really view it as a rewilding and reclaiming our body's natural process of adaptation, which is our stress response. It's about changing how we orient to stress and moving through emotions. And it has changed my life. So I'll definitely be sharing more. Similar is somatic experiencing, also known as SE. So SE is similar to somatic stress release. In fact, Dr. Scott Lyons, who founded the Embody Lab and leads somatic stress release, is also a somatic experiencing practitioner. So I know he brings a lot of that in. Can't exactly define the ways they're different, but my understanding is that somatic experiencing is much more focused on capital T trauma and PTSD, whereas somatic stress release is a bit more all-encompassing of like any emotion, any energy, not just past stored trauma. So SE is about physically moving through the trauma that's stored, helping people embody safety, helping people come into their body more. And it's really, really powerful for people who've experienced trauma. sensory motor psychotherapy is one that you're very likely to experience in a therapist's office. It's much more oriented to therapists. And this is all about kind of understanding how our body holds specific patterns, how, a lot of this stems from our attachment and relationships and past experiences, and helping people, again, all of these focus on somatic awareness, but really the interventions are focusing on helping clients become more aware of their movements and gestures and impulses, and all related to attachment and relationships. Maybe that's not completely accurate, but that's my orientation to it. Another common one that you might not realize is somatics is eye motion desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. So in this, someone is either kind of moving their eyes, or there's a beeping sound on either side, or they're tapping, and it's essentially using bilateral stimulation while they're talking about an event, while they're getting triggered, to desensitize that reaction and help someone essentially hopefully no longer get so triggered by it, because you're signaling to the body that you're safe. This is maybe even more mainstream than the previous one, and very common in therapy offices. However, I just will flag that it can be re-traumatizing, because you're bringing all this shit up, you're reliving it, and I have had clients who actually experienced an increase in their PTSD and complex PTSD symptoms after doing this, because it's like it stirred the pot on all the things that were in the past. Whereas, for example, with my work, we don't always necessarily like revisit the exact thing that happened. We more orient to like, how's it impacting you now? And I also incorporate some inner child work. So how's your inner child impacted? But we don't need to like relive the past. And that's something that is common in many modalities, and in a way that somatics compares to talk therapy is we're not trying to necessarily change your thoughts. We're not trying to necessarily rehash all the details of what happened to you. We're much more oriented with helping your body relearn safety, unlearn some of those patterns that aren't serving you, and live in the here and now with intentionality, with presence, and in a way that orients you to be able to make the future that you long for possible. So that's a little bit about my version of somatics. I think just the other thing I want to add is that somatics is distinct from mindfulness, and they both have a time and place, and some of the practices actually do look and feel very similar. But in many traditions that use mindfulness meditations and practices, there's this orientation towards detachment from sensations and detachment from thoughts, and to identify with the witness. And the unintended implication is that this can actually make people really good at disassociating. It can make them really good at exiting their bodies and floating away. And for folks who've experienced trauma, they're already really good at this. And so that's actually not beneficial. And for people who've experienced trauma, like that can actually be majorly distressing if they're very activated, or can, increase that habituated pattern of disassociating. So in a somatic mindful practice, yes, we're feeling sensation and we're getting curious about it. Again, we're like, what is this here to tell me? What is my body communicating? What are the unmet needs? It's more about, how do I connect with my body to be more in relationship with what's present, and not how do I drop into my body to not be affected by what's present. And the interesting thing is, the more that we are in relationship and can be with what's present, the less debilitating it is, the less intense it is. We're like, yeah, there's pain. Yep. She sure does talk up when I haven't slept well. Thanks, pain. Thank you for telling me. I will take a nap today. And again, going back to social change, disassociating has its time and a place. But if that's the only way we know how to deal with a stressful world, ooh, yeah, that's not going to serve us in the long run. We need this complex toolkit of different tools and practices to support us. And I believe somatics provides so many of those. And then I think one more thing is just that parts work, meaning working with our different parts, is a really great way to incorporate somatics. It's not always somatically oriented, but we're seeing definitely more of that. And internal family systems is one method of parts work, but you can just tune into your little inner child. But the idea being that we have these different parts, and if we view sensation as a part instead of a thing to be managed or numbed out, we can get curious about, what is this part needing from me? Why is it necessarily speaking in the way that it's speaking? How can I meet its needs? So parts work and somatics really blend very, very beautifully. Y'all, somatics is just, it's been life-changing for me. And when I think about where I was at 3 years ago, not wanting to live, in pain every day, so depressed, so anxious, struggling so profoundly, and to where I'm at now, I'm a believer. I've drank the Kool-Aid. But again, it's not this woo-woo shit. Like, I'm trained as a researcher. I have my master's in public health. I'm taught to be very critical on what we know and how to design interventions that work. And for me, the data is so promising, even if we don't have randomized control trials on somatic experiencing, or, there's rich data on each piece, and how they come together therapeutically is so beautiful. And I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in others. Somatics is just a really, really exciting and game-changing way to work with yourself and to support yourself in your life, and how you want to show up, and how you want to orient to a future that freaking excites you. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of like 101 of what does somatics mean to Jaclyn, and I'm genuinely curious what questions you have. Hope this was great. Until next time, my friend. Bye.